Imagine this. You come home early to surprise the man who swore you were his forever. Your fated mate. Your Alpha King. The one the moon goddess herself chose for you. The sacred moon pool is glowing, steam rising, water lapping softly. And there he is. Moving inside your own sister. Whispering mine against her skin, the exact word he once growled in your ear. Your heart stops. Your wolf howls in agony. The sacred mate bond twists like a knife, forcing you to feel every single thrust, every gasp, every betrayal. You stand frozen at the edge of the pool. Tears burning. World shattering. And then, he looks up. Those storm gray eyes that used to make you melt, lock onto yours. Shock. Guilt. Fear. What do you do in that moment? Do you scream and tear them apart? Do you run and never look back? Or do you stand there, broken, and let the pain carve you into something new? Something unstoppable? This is Nova's story. A story of the deepest betrayal, and the most shattering heartbreak. The full moon rode low over the black pines, spilling silver across the ancient stone walls of the royal den like liquid starlight. I had always believed nights like this were made for us. For me and Kael. My Alpha King. My fated mate. The man the moon goddess herself had carved from my very soul. I slipped through the massive oak doors earlier than planned. The hunt had been short. The stag had fallen too easily, almost as if the forest had conspired to hurry me home. A strange, fluttering ache had bloomed in my chest all evening, whispering that something wasn't right. I ignored it. I wanted to surprise him. To walk into our chambers and feel his strong arms crush me against him. His lips finding mine in that slow, hungry way that always made the world disappear. My boots whispered against the polished stone as I moved deeper into the den. Torchlight danced along the walls, but the real light came from the moon herself, pouring through the high windows like a blessing. I smiled softly, already imagining his face. Those storm gray eyes widening in delight. That wicked, crooked grin spreading before he pulled me close and growled against my throat. You're home early, my Luna. My heart beat faster. I followed the familiar path to the heart of our home, the sacred moon pool. Our sanctuary. The glowing cavern where the water shimmered with its own inner moonlight, warm and alive, blessed by the goddess for centuries. It was where we had first claimed each other. Where Kael had pressed me against the smooth stone edge and made me his under the full moon. Slow and reverent, then wild and desperate. The way the water had rippled around us. The way his hands had gripped my hips. The way his growl had vibrated through my bones. It had felt like the entire universe had approved. Tonight, the bond thrummed hot and eager in my veins. I could already taste him on the air. But as I stepped beneath the arched entrance, the world cracked open. Soft, breathy moans floated across the glowing water. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks. Then, I saw them. Two bodies tangled in the center of the pool. Silver light caressing bare skin. His broad, muscled back. Kael's back. The dark hair I loved to thread my fingers through, now damp and wild. And beneath him, Mara. My own sister. Her long raven hair fanned out across the water like spilled ink. Her legs were wrapped tightly around his waist. Her head thrown back in pure ecstasy as he moved inside her. Deep. Deliberate. Possessive. The air punched out of my lungs. I stood rooted at the edge of the pool, fingers digging into the rough stone arch until my knuckles bled white. The mate bond twisted like a blade in my chest. Sharp. Merciless. Alive. It should have snapped the moment he touched her. It should have died. But it didn't. It burned brighter, forcing me to feel every slow thrust, every shuddering gasp, every whispered word he breathed against her throat. Mine, Kael growled low. The word that had once been my entire world. Now, it belonged to her. Tears stung my eyes, hot and immediate. My wolf, Lyra, screamed inside me. Clawing. Howling in agony and fury, She begged to rip them apart, to tear his throat out, to drag Mara under the water until she stopped breathing. But my human heart held her back. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. They hadn't seen me yet. They were lost in each other. Kael's hand slid up Mara's sides, cupping her breasts, thumbs brushing her nipples in that exact way he used to worship mine. She arched into him, nails raking down his back, moaning his name like a prayer. Kael, yes, just like that. My name had once sounded the same on his lips. A sob clawed its way out of me. Small. Broken. But it echoed across the sacred water. Kael's head snapped up. Those storm gray eyes locked onto mine. For one frozen heartbeat, the world stopped. Shock. Guilt. Then something darker. Fear. Raw and real. He stilled inside her, but Mara hadn't noticed. She whimpered, rolling her hips, chasing the pleasure he had suddenly abandoned. Kael? She breathed. Confused. His gaze never left me. Nova, he rasped, voice rough with something that might have been regret. He reached one hand toward me across the glowing water, as if he could pull me back from the abyss. I shook my head, tears streaming down my cheeks. Don't, I whispered. The word carried everything. Every vow we'd sworn. Every night I'd fallen asleep with his heartbeat against my back. Every time I believed I was safe in his arms. I took one step back. Then another. He surged forward through the water, leaving Mara behind. She gasped, reaching for him, but he didn't look at her. Nova. Wait. I turned and ran. The corridors blurred. Torchlight flickering. Stone cold under my bare feet. Lyra howled in my mind, the sound tearing through every nerve. The bond stretched, painful, fraying like a rope about to snap. I burst into the night air. The full moon mocked me from above, bright and indifferent. The forest swallowed me. I ran until my lungs screamed and my legs buckled. I collapsed against an ancient oak, chest heaving, tears soaking the earth. The pain was everywhere. Sharp. Consuming. Endless. And yet, beneath the wreckage, a tiny, defiant spark flickered. I was still breathing. I was still Nova. And deep inside, Lyra lifted her head and whispered, "We will rise." The moon watched in silence as I curled into myself. Shattered, but not destroyed. And through the tears, I smiled. Because this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The ancient oak's bark pressed rough against my back as I curled into myself on the forest floor. My breath came in ragged, sobbing gasps. The full moon still watched from above, cold, unblinking, indifferent to the wreckage it had witnessed. Every heartbeat hurt. The mate bond thrummed like a live wire in my chest, refusing to die even after what I'd seen. It tugged toward him. Toward Kael. Even now, even as the image of him moving inside Mara burned behind my eyelids, the betrayal was a poison spreading through every vein, every thought, every memory we'd ever shared. I pressed my palm hard against my sternum, as if I could crush the bond out of existence. Stop, I begged it silently. Just stop. But it only pulsed harder, a cruel reminder that the moon goddess's gift didn't break easily. It had to be severed. Lyra, my wolf, whimpered inside me. Low. Mournful. Broken. She had loved him too. She had run beside him under these same stars. Felt his powerful wolf claim her in the wild. Felt safe in his shadow. Now, she felt only rage and grief. Two emotions warring so fiercely I thought I might tear apart. I don't know how long I lay there. Minutes. Hours. Time had lost meaning. The night air grew colder, dew settling on my skin like tears the sky couldn't hold back. Then, I felt it. A ripple in the pack link. A faint, desperate tug. Nova, please, come back. Kael's voice. Raw and fractured. Echoing inside my mind. He was searching for me. He was panicking. Good. Let him feel what it's like to reach for something that's already gone. I shoved the link shut with every ounce of will I had left, slamming a wall between us so thick even the bond shuddered. The pain of it was blinding, white hot, like ripping my own soul in half. But I welcomed it. Pain meant I was still fighting. Slowly, I pushed myself up. My legs trembled, but they held. I lifted my face to the moon and let the silver light wash over me. I am Nova, I whispered to the night. Luna of the Silver Fang Pack. Daughter of the crescent moon. Sister to Mara. And no longer the fool who believed love was enough. My voice cracked on the last word, but I forced myself to keep going. I reject what has been done to me. I reject the lies. I reject the pain. The words weren't the formal rejection yet, that would come later, in front of the pack, under the goddess's full witness. But these were mine. Private. Sacred. A vow carved into my own heart. And then, because the night needed to hear it too, I added the smallest, most dangerous promise of all. I will rise. The wind stirred the leaves above me, almost like an answer. I straightened my spine, wiped the tears from my cheeks, and began to walk. Not toward the den. Never toward the den again. I moved deeper into the forest, toward the old hunting trails only the elders still remembered. Toward the forgotten borders, where the pack scent grew faint and the wild called louder. My body ached with every step, grief heavy as iron. But something else was waking too. Anger. Pride. A quiet, burning determination that tasted almost like hope. I walked until dawn bled pink across the horizon. I found a small clearing near a trickling stream and sank down beside it. My reflection stared back at me. Wild hair. Tear-streaked face. Eyes that looked older than they had yesterday. I looked broken. But I also looked alive. And then, the memory came. Unbidden. Cruel. And beautiful. Months ago. Another full moon. Kael and I had slipped away from the pack celebration, laughing like children as we raced toward the sacred moonpool. The water had glowed brighter than ever that night, as if the goddess herself had lit extra candles just for us. He'd caught me at the edge, spun me into his arms, and kissed me until the world spun. Mine, he'd growled against my lips, voice thick with hunger. Always, I'd breathed back. I blinked the memory away, tears falling fresh into the stream. He had lied. And yet, the memory still warmed me, still made my body ache with remembered pleasure even as my heart bled. I hated him for that most of all. The sun climbed higher. Birds began to sing. I stood, brushed the dirt from my clothes, and kept walking. By midday, I reached the old hunter's cabin. Abandoned for years, half hidden by ivy and thyme. I pushed the door open. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through cracked windows. It wasn't much. A dusty bed, a small hearth, a single table. But it was mine. For the first time since I'd run, I allowed myself to feel the exhaustion. I sank onto the bed, curled into a ball, and let the tears come again. Quiet this time. Almost peaceful. And as sleep finally pulled me under, one last thought drifted through my mind. He will come for me. He will beg. And I will decide whether he gets to keep any piece of my heart at all. But even deeper, softer, a tiny voice whispered something I wasn't ready to hear yet. You are enough. You are always enough. And somewhere in the depths of my body, something new stirred. Something small, fragile, and impossibly precious. The dream came soft and strange. I was floating in warm darkness, weightless, cradled by something ancient and gentle. A tiny heartbeat echoed through me. Fast. Fluttering. Like a bird trapped in my chest. Not mine alone. Ours. My hand rested over my lower belly, even in sleep, fingers splayed protectively. A quiet joy bloomed behind my ribs, fragile and bright, before the pain of waking dragged me back. Sunlight sliced through the cracked window of the hunter's cabin, painting golden stripes across the dusty floorboards. My body ached, muscles stiff from running, heart bruised from everything else. But that small, secret heartbeat lingered in my mind like a promise. I sat up slowly, pressing my palm harder against my stomach. Could it be? I closed my eyes and listened inward. Lyra stirred, quiet but alert. She sniffed the air inside me, then let out a soft, reverent whine. Pup. The word hit like thunder wrapped in silk. Tears welled up again, but these were different. Hot. Aching. And strangely grateful. A child. His child. Kael's child. The thought should have broken me all over again. Instead, it anchored me. This little life hadn't asked to be born into betrayal. It deserved better. We deserved better. I stood, shaky but determined, and moved to the small basin in the corner. I splashed cold water on my face, letting it drip down my neck. In the cracked mirror above it, I met my own eyes. Red-rimmed. Fierce. Alive. I won't let him take you from me, I whispered to the reflection. To the child. To the moon that had already set. Not ever. The day passed in quiet survival. I gathered firewood from the edge of the clearing, scavenged berries and roots I knew were safe, built a small fire in the hearth. Every movement felt deliberate, almost sacred. I was building something new. A life. A refuge. As dusk fell, the forest grew restless. A low growl rumbled through the trees. Not angry, but watchful. My wolf snapped to attention. Lyra's hackles rose. Someone was close. I stepped outside, the door creaking behind me. The air smelled of rain and pine and wolf. Not Pack. Not Kael. Something wilder. Rougher. Scarred. A shadow detached from the trees. He was tall. Taller than Kael. Broad-shouldered, clad in worn black leather and faded linen. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, tangled with leaves. A jagged scar ran from his left temple down his cheek, disappearing beneath the collar of his shirt. His eyes were the color of storm clouds at midnight. Sharp. Guarded. And impossibly deep. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, hands loose at his sides, showing he meant no threat. You're far from Packlands, little Luna, he said. His voice was low, gravel rough, carrying the faintest trace of an accent I couldn't place. I lifted my chin. I'm no one's Luna anymore. His gaze flickered over me, taking in the tear-streaked face, the borrowed cloak too big for my frame, the way my hand unconsciously rested over my belly. Something softened in those storm eyes, just for a second. Rogue, he said simply, answering the question I hadn't asked. Name's Jax. Nova, I replied, though I wasn't sure why I gave him my real name. He tilted his head, studying me. You smell of grief. And new life. My breath caught. How could he know? He lifted a hand, palm out. I mean you know harm. I've been watching the borders. Saw you run last night. Saw the king tear through the forest, calling your name like a madman. I flinched at the mention of Kael. Jax's jaw tightened. He's still searching. Won't stop until he finds you. Let him search, I said, voice steadier than I felt. He'll find only what's left. Rain began to fall then. Soft at first, then harder. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Jax glanced at the sky, then back at me. You'll catch your death out here. Come inside. I won't touch you. I swear it on the moon. I hesitated, but the cold was sinking into my bones, and the child inside me needed warmth. I nodded once. He followed me into the cabin, keeping a careful distance. He moved with the quiet grace of someone who had lived alone a long time, every step deliberate. Never crowding. I stoked the fire while he stood near the door, dripping rainwater onto the floorboards. Why are you helping me? I asked without turning around. Because I know what it feels like to be cast out, he said quietly. And because you smell like hope. Even through the pain. I turned then. Our eyes met across the small room. The firelight danced over his scarred face, turning the jagged lines silver. Something electric passed between us. Not the mate bond, not yet, but something raw and real. A recognition. Two broken souls seeing each other clearly for the first time. He took one slow step closer. Rain hammered the roof. I didn't move away. He stopped just short of touching me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. His gaze dropped to my lips, then lifted again. Nova. He breathed, voice rough with something like longing. My heart stuttered. The air between us thickened, charged like the storm outside. He lifted a hand, slow, careful, and brushed a wet strand of hair from my cheek. The touch was feather-light. Reverent. I closed my eyes, leaning into it just a fraction. Thunder cracked overhead. And then his lips hovered near mine, so close I could taste the rain on his breath. But he didn't kiss me. Not yet. Instead, he whispered against my mouth. You don't have to be alone anymore. Lightning flashed, illuminating his face. Scarred. Beautiful. Fierce. And in that moment, something inside me cracked open. Not healed. Not yet. But hopeful. The storm raged outside the hunter's cabin. Wind howling through the trees like a grieving wolf. Rain lashed the roof in furious sheets. Inside, the fire crackled low, casting long shadows across the walls. Jack stood frozen inches from me, his breath warm against my lips. The almost kiss hung between us. Electric. Fragile. Full of unspoken promises. And then, her voice sliced through the pack link like a poisoned blade. Enjoy your little hideaway, sister. But you should know, he still calls my name in his sleep. Mara. The words dripped with smug triumph. Laced with the kind of cruelty only a sister could wield so perfectly. My body went rigid. The fragile warmth that had begun to bloom in my chest iced over. Jax felt it immediately. His hand dropped from my cheek, eyes narrowing with concern. Nova, he murmured. I stepped back, pressing a hand to my temple as if I could physically push her voice out of my mind. She's in my head, I whispered. Taunting me. Jax's jaw clenched. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. The scent of betrayal still clung to me like smoke. I closed my eyes, forcing the link shut again. But the damage was done. The wound she'd reopened burned fresh. I turned away from him, arms wrapped tight around myself. I can't stay here, I said quietly. Not like this. Not while we're still connected. Jax watched me for a long moment. Then, he nodded once. You need to do it formally, he said. Sever the bond. In front of witnesses. Under the moon. I knew he was right. The private vows I'd whispered to the night weren't enough. The goddess demanded a public breaking. A ceremony of rejection that would echo through the packlands and sever the golden thread forever. It would hurt more than anything had ever hurt. But staying tethered to Kael, feeling every time he touched her, every time he whispered her name, that would destroy me slower. I lifted my chin. Tomorrow night. The full moon peaks again. I'll do it then. Jax's storm gray eyes searched mine. You don't have to do it alone. I know, I said softly. But I need to. He didn't argue. He simply stepped closer again. Not to kiss me this time, but to rest his forehead gently against mine. I'll stand with you, he whispered. Even if it's from the shadows. The next night came too quickly. The moon rose fat and silver over the ancient clearing known as the Moonlight Circle, an open glade ringed by towering oaks, sacred ground where pack ceremonies had been held for centuries. I had walked there alone, Jax trailing at a respectful distance behind me. He would not enter the circle. This was mine to face. Word had spread through the hidden channels of the pack. They knew I had returned. They knew what I intended. They came. Dozens of wolves, some in human form, some shifted, gathered at the edge of the clearing. Their eyes gleamed in the moonlight. Whispers rippled through them like wind through leaves. Kael stood at the far side, flanked by his betas. Even from across the circle, I could see the torment carved into his face. Dark circles under those storm-gray eyes. Hair wild. Jaw clenched so tight I thought it might shatter. Mara stood beside him. Chin high. Lips curved in a satisfied smile. She wore a gown of deep crimson, as if celebrating a victory. My stomach twisted, but I walked forward anyway. Head high. Bare feet silent on the cool grass. The pack fell silent. I stopped in the center of the circle, directly beneath the moon. Kael's gaze locked onto mine. Pain. Regret. Desperation. Nova, he rasped, voice breaking on my name. I ignored him. I lifted my face to the moon and spoke the words that would change everything. Moon goddess, eternal witness, hear me. I, Nova, of the Silver Fang Pack, daughter of the crescent moon, once bound to Alpha King Kael by the sacred mate bond. I reject him. Gasps rippled through the gathered wolves. Kael staggered as if I'd struck him. I continued, voice steady even as tears streamed down my cheeks. I reject the bond that was forged in lies. I reject the love that was betrayed. I reject the alpha who chose another over his true mate. The air crackled with power. The mate bond flared. Bright. Blinding. Agonizing. Pain exploded through my chest like wildfire. I cried out, doubling over, clutching my heart as the golden thread began to fray. Kael roared, a sound of pure anguish, and lunged forward, only to be held back by his betas. Nova. No. Please. But it was too late. The bond snapped. A scream tore from my throat. Raw. Animal. Shattering. The world tilted. My knees buckled. I fell to the grass, vision blurring with tears and moonlight. The pack watched in stunned silence. Mara's smile faltered just for a second. Kael broke free of his betas and dropped to his knees at the edge of the circle, hands reaching toward me. Nova, he choked. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I lifted my head, meeting his gaze one last time. You were everything to me, I whispered. And you threw it away. Then I pushed myself up. Shaking. Bleeding inside. But standing. The severed bond left a hollow ache where warmth had once lived. But in its place, freedom grew. Painful. Beautiful. I turned my back on them all and walked out of the circle. Jax waited at the tree-line, eyes shining with something fierce and proud. He didn't speak. He simply fell into step beside me. Behind us, Kael's broken howl echoed through the night. As Nova and Jax disappear into the forest, a new, frantic pulse surges through the pack link. Not Mara's voice this time, but Kael's. Wild and unraveling. She's carrying my child. I can feel it. I can feel them both. The forest swallowed us whole as Jax and I slipped deeper into the shadows. Kael's broken howl still echoing behind us like a wound that refused to close. The night air was thick with the scent of pine and rain-soaked earth. But all I could taste was the sharp, metallic tang of freedom, and the hollow ache where the mate bond used to live. My legs trembled with every step. The severance still burning through my veins like liquid fire. Jax walked close, not touching, but near enough that I could feel the steady heat of him. A quiet anchor in the storm inside me. We didn't speak for a long time. There were no words big enough for what had just happened. When we finally reached a small, sheltered hollow beneath a massive fallen tree, Jax stopped. Moonlight filtered through the branches in thin silver threads, painting his scarred face in soft, heartbreaking strokes. Sit, he said gently. You're shaking. I sank onto the mossy ground, knees drawn to my chest. The pain of the broken bond pulsed in waves, each one sharper than the last. It felt like part of my soul had been torn away, leaving raw edges that screamed every time I breathed. Jax crouched in front of me. Close, but not crowding. his storm gray eyes searching mine with a tenderness that made my throat tighten. "You did it," he whispered. "You're free." Tears slipped down my cheeks before I could stop them. "It doesn't feel like freedom yet," I admitted, voice cracking. "It feels like dying slowly." He reached out then. Slowly. Carefully. And brushed a tear from my cheek with the pad of his thumb. The touch was feather light. Reverent. And it sent a quiet shiver through me. Not lust. Not heat. Just connection. The first gentle thing I'd felt since the pool. "I know," he said softly. "I've carried that kind of pain too. It doesn't vanish overnight. But it fades. And one day, you wake up and realize you're still here. Still whole." I looked at him. Really looked. The scar that ran down his cheek caught the moonlight, a silver reminder of battles he'd survived. His eyes held storms I hadn't noticed before. Grief. Loneliness. Quiet strength. "How did you survive it?" I asked. He exhaled slowly, gaze dropping to the ground between us. "I didn't. For a long time. I wandered. I fought. I hated the moon for a while." A small, sad smile touched his lips. "Then I realized, the goddess doesn't break us to destroy us. She breaks us to remake us. Stronger." His words settled over me like a blanket. Warm. Heavy. True. I reached out, hesitant, and rested my hand over his where it rested on his knee. His skin was warm, rough from years of living wild. He froze for a heartbeat, then turned his palm up and laced his fingers through mine. The simple contact grounded me. No rush of power. No overwhelming pull. Just two hands holding each other in the dark. We stayed like that for what felt like hours. Silent. Breathing in sync. Letting the night wrap around us. Eventually, the worst of the pain ebbed into a dull, throbbing ache. I leaned my head back against the tree trunk and closed my eyes. "I'm carrying his child," I whispered. Jax's hand tightened around mine. "Just a fraction." "I know. I don't want him near us," I said fiercely. "Not after what he did." "Then he won't be," Jax answered, voice low and certain. "Not if you don't want him to be." I opened my eyes and met his gaze. In the moonlight, his expression was fierce and gentle all at once. Protective in a way that made my heart stutter. "Thank you," I breathed. "For standing with me tonight. For everything." He shook his head slowly. "You don't owe me thanks, Nova. You're the strongest person I've ever met." The words landed soft and deep, stirring something warm beneath the ashes of my pain. I squeezed his hand. "I don't feel strong." "You are," he said simply. "You just walked away from the man who was supposed to be here forever, and you're still standing. That's not weakness. That's fire." A small, trembling smile curved my lips. The first real one since the pool. Jax's eyes softened. And for a moment, the world narrowed to just us. Two broken souls sitting in the moonlight, holding on to each other like lifelines. He lifted my hand to his lips and pressed the gentlest kiss to my knuckles. Nothing demanding. Nothing heated. Just quiet reverence. And in that single touch, something inside me began to heal. Not all at once. Not completely. But enough to breathe again. Enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, there could be light after this darkness. As the first pale light of dawn creeps through the trees, a low, desperate growl echoes from the distance. Kael's wolf. Closer than ever. Driven half mad by the severed bond and the scent of his unborn child. He's coming. And he's not stopping. The first pale fingers of dawn crept through the trees, turning the world soft gray and gold. Jax and I sat in the sheltered hollow, hands still linked. The quiet between us heavy with everything we hadn't said yet. Then, it came. A low, desperate growl rolled across the forest floor. Close. Too close. Kael's wolf. The sound wasn't angry. It was broken. Raw. The cry of something that had lost its anchor and was tearing itself apart trying to find it again. Jax's grip tightened on my hand. His body went still. Every muscle coiled, ready to protect. "He's here," he whispered. I felt it before I heard the branches snap. The air shifted. The scent of him, pine, storm, and the faint trace of the moonpool, flooded my senses like a punch to the chest. I stood slowly, heart hammering. Through the trees, he emerged. Kael. Not the proud Alpha King I had once loved. This was a man unraveling. His dark hair was wild, tangled with leaves and dirt. His shirt hung open, torn at the shoulder, chest heaving with ragged breaths. His eyes, those storm-gray eyes I used to lose myself in, were bloodshot, pupils blown wide with grief and madness. He looked like he hadn't slept since the night I ran. He stopped at the edge of the hollow, trembling. "Nova." His voice cracked on my name, barely more than a rasp. Jax stepped half in front of me, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Kael's gaze flicked to him, sharp, possessive, dangerous. Then back to me. "I can feel it," he said, voice shaking. "The child. Our child. It's like a second heartbeat inside me. I can't breathe without feeling them both. You and the pup." Tears burned my eyes. I hated that he could still feel it. I hated that part of me still ached at the sound of his voice. "You have no right," I said, voice low and steady despite the storm inside me. "You lost that right the moment you touched her. In our sacred place." Kael flinched as if I'd struck him. He took one step forward. Jax bared his teeth. "Stay back." Kael ignored him, eyes locked on mine. "I know what I did," he whispered. "I know I destroyed everything. I was weak. I was stupid. Mara, she..." He choked on the words, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter. Nothing excuses it. But I can't lose you. I can't lose our child." "You already did," I said softly. The words hung between us like a blade. Kael dropped to his knees in the damp earth, head bowed. "I'll beg," he said brokenly. "I'll crawl if that's what it takes. Just let me see you. Let me protect you both. Please, Nova. I'm dying without you." Every word tore at the remnants of what we'd once had. The bond might be severed, but the memories weren't. The nights he'd held me like I was the only thing keeping the world from falling apart. The way he'd whisper my name like a prayer when we made love under the moon. The promises he'd broken. I stepped forward, past Jax's protective stance, until I stood just out of reach. "Look at me," I said. He lifted his head. Tears streamed down his face. Silent. Endless. "You were my everything," I told him, voice trembling but strong. "And you chose to shatter me. You chose her over us. Over this child. You don't get to come back and claim what you threw away." Kael's shoulders shook with silent sobs. "I'll spend the rest of my life making it right," he whispered. "I swear on the goddess, on our child. I'll never touch another. I'll never look at another. Just give me a chance to prove it." Jax's hand found the small of my back. Gentle. Steady. Grounding. I drew in a shaky breath. "I don't trust your promises anymore," I said. "And I won't let you near this child until I know you're safe to be around. Until you've earned back even the smallest piece of what you destroyed." Kael's eyes closed in agony. "I understand," he breathed. "I'll wait. I'll wait forever if I have to." Then he rose slowly. Every movement pained, as if the weight of his own regret might crush him. "I love you," he said, voice cracking. "I always will." He turned and walked away. Slow. Defeated. Disappearing into the trees like a ghost. The forest fell silent again. I stood there, trembling, until Jax gently turned me to face him. He didn't speak. He just pulled me into his arms. Slow. Careful. Offering shelter without demanding anything. I buried my face in his chest and let the tears come. Quiet. Cleansing. Releasing. He held me through it all, and in the safety of his embrace, I felt the first true flicker of something new. Not love. Not yet. But peace. As the morning sun rises higher, a sharp, frantic pulse surges through the pack link again. This time, Mara's voice. Wild and furious. You think you can just walk away and take his air with you? I'll burn everything down before I let you win, sister. The morning sun climbed higher, spilling golden light through the canopy and warming the damp earth beneath our feet. Jax still held me, his arms a quiet fortress around my trembling frame. The echo of Mara's venomous words lingered in the pack link like smoke. Sharp. Acrid. Refusing to fade. I'll burn everything down before I let you win, sister. I pulled back just enough to meet Jax's gaze. His storm gray eyes were steady, fierce with a protectiveness that made my chest ache in the most tender way. She won't touch you, he said, voice low and certain. Not you. Not the child. Not while I'm breathing. The promise wrapped around me like sunlight after endless night. I reached up, fingertips brushing the jagged scar along his cheek. Slow. Reverent. Tracing the story it told of survival. I believe you, I whispered. Something shifted between us then. Not a rush of fire. Not a desperate claim. But a slow, deep kindling. A warmth that started in the center of my chest and spread outward. Soft and bright. And terrifyingly beautiful. Jax's hand covered mine where it rested against his face. He turned his head and pressed his lips to my palm. Gentle. Lingering. A kiss that felt like a vow. I've wandered alone for so long, he said quietly. I thought that was my fate. Then I saw you run through the forest that night. Broken. But still so damn strong. And I realized, maybe I wasn't meant to be alone forever. My breath caught. I'm scared, I admitted, voice barely above a whisper. After everything. I don't know if I can trust this feeling again. He nodded, understanding etched into every line of his face. Then we go slow, he said. We take every step together. No pressure. No rush. Just us. Healing. Finding our way. Tears pricked my eyes again. Not from pain this time, but from something softer. Hope. I leaned forward and rested my forehead against his. Our breaths mingled in the small space between us. The world narrowed to the warmth of his skin, the steady beat of his heart against mine, the quiet promise that maybe love didn't always have to hurt. We stayed like that until the sun was fully risen. Then, hand in hand, we walked deeper into the wildlands. Away from the pack. Away from the den. Away from the ghosts that still haunted me. Days blurred into a gentle rhythm. We built a small camp near a clear mountain stream. Jax taught me how to set snares, how to read the wind for coming storms. I showed him the old crescent moon lullabies my mother used to sing, songs I hadn't thought of in years. At night, we sat by the fire, shoulders brushing, sharing stories of the lives we'd lived before everything shattered. With every passing hour, the hollow ache in my chest grew smaller. One evening, as the sky turned the softest shade of lavender, I sat on a flat rock overlooking the valley. The child moved inside me, a tiny flutter, like butterfly wings against my ribs. I smiled, resting my hand over the gentle swell. Jax came up behind me, silent as always. He didn't speak. He simply sat beside me, close enough that our arms touched. I turned to him. Jax. I think I'm starting to feel something again. Something real. His eyes searched mine. Careful. Hopeful. Tell me, he breathed. I took his hand and placed it over my heart. Here, I said softly. It's small. It's scared. But it's growing. And it's because of you. He exhaled shakily, eyes shining. I've never wanted anything more than I want this, he confessed. You. The child. A future that doesn't hurt. I leaned into him then, letting my head rest on his shoulder. His arm came around me. Strong. Steady. Safe. We watched the first stars appear one by one. And in that quiet moment, under a sky full of light, I felt joy again. Pure, fragile, breathtaking joy. As the stars brighten overhead, a sudden, violent tremor ripples through the ground. The stream surges unnaturally. From the darkness of the trees, Mara steps forward. Her eyes glowing with unnatural silver light, a dark, forbidden rune pulsing on her palm. She smiles. Cruel and triumphant. I told you I'd burn it all down, sister. And I brought something to help me do it. The stars had barely begun to glitter when the ground trembled beneath us. The stream surged forward in a violent rush, water climbing its banks like it had been called to war. Then, she stepped from the darkness. Mara. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural silver light. Cold. Feral. Wrong. On her upturned palm, a dark rune pulsed like a living heartbeat, black veins crawling across her skin. The air around her crackled with forbidden power. The scent of old blood and scorched earth clinging to her like smoke. She smiled. Slow. Cruel. Triumphant. I told you I'd burn it all down, sister, she said, voice dripping with venom. And I brought something to help me do it. Jax was on his feet in an instant, body angled protectively in front of me, a deep growl rumbling from his chest. Stay back, he snarled. Mara laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that cut through the night. Oh, rogue. How sweet. You think you can protect what's mine? She's not yours, I said, stepping forward despite the fear clawing at my throat. My hand instinctively went to my belly. And neither is this child. Mara's gaze dropped to the small swell, and something vicious flashed across her face. Jealousy so raw it twisted her features. You think you can just walk away with his heir? She hissed. After everything I've done? After I finally took what should have been mine from the beginning? You took nothing, I said quietly. You stole. And you'll pay for it. The rune on her palm flared brighter. She lifted her hand, and shadows began to coil around her fingers. Dark tendrils that reached toward us like hungry serpents. Jax shoved me behind him. Run, Nova. But I couldn't. My feet were rooted, not from fear alone, but from fury. From the fierce, blazing need to protect the life growing inside me. The shadows lunged. Jax met them head-on, shifting in a blur of fur and fury. His wolf was massive, scarred, beautiful in its wildness. He tore through the darkness, snapping and snarling, but the shadows kept coming. Relentless. Multiplying. Mara laughed again. She raised her other hand, and a bolt of dark energy shot forward, aimed straight at my heart. Time slowed. I felt the child flutter inside me. Small. Strong. Alive. And something inside me snapped awake. Not my wolf. Something deeper. Something older. A pulse of pure silver light erupted from my chest. Bright. Blinding. Protective. It slammed into the dark bolt and shattered it into harmless sparks. Mara staggered back, eyes wide with shock. What? I stepped forward, trembling, but unafraid. You will not touch us, I said, voice steady and low. Not tonight. Not ever. The silver light wrapped around me like armor, warm and fierce. Jax's wolf circled back to my side, pressing against my leg. Solid. Loyal. Proud. Mara's rune flickered, weakening. You think this changes anything? She spat. I'll come for you again. And next time, I interrupted, you'll face the mother of his heir. And you'll lose. she snarled, the shadows around her retreating like frightened animals. This isn't over, she hissed. Then she turned and vanished into the trees, the unnatural light fading with her. The forest fell silent once more. I sank to my knees, the silver light dimming until only the moonlight remained. My body shook with exhaustion, with relief, with something that felt dangerously close to triumph. Jax shifted back, human again, and dropped beside me. He pulled me into his arms without a word. I buried my face in his neck, breathing him in. Pine. Rain. Safety. You were incredible, he whispered against my hair. You protected them both. Tears slipped down my cheeks. Hot. Cleansing. I was so scared, I admitted. I know, he said softly. But you weren't alone. He held me tighter, and I let myself melt into him, letting the fear drain away, letting the fierce protectiveness settle into something steady and sure. We stayed like that until the first birds began to sing. And in the quiet dawn, with Jax's heartbeat steady against mine, I felt something unbreakable take root inside me. Not just survival. Not just hope. But power. The power of a mother. Of a woman who had been broken, and had chosen to rise anyway. The sun climbs higher. A new sound reaches us. Distant horns echoing across the valley. The Silver Fang Pack's war horns. Kael is calling every able wolf to arms. And the message that follows through the pack link is clear and desperate. The dark magic has spread. Mara has allied with the Shadowborn. They're coming for the child. And they're coming for war. The war horns faded into the morning mist, leaving only the heavy silence that follows a declaration of battle. Jax and I stood frozen on the rocky outcrop above the valley, the wind whipping through our hair. Below us, the forest seemed to hold its breath. They're coming, I whispered. Jax's hand found mine. Firm. Warm. Unbreakable. Then we meet them, he said quietly. Together. We descended the slope in silence, every step measured, every heartbeat loud in my ears. The child inside me fluttered again, small, steady, reminding me why I couldn't falter. By midday, we reached the edge of the old battlefield, an ancient clearing scarred by generations of conflict, ringed by towering stones carved with runes long faded. The Silver Fang Pack had already gathered. Hundreds of wolves, some shifted, some human, stood in tense formation. At their center stood Kael. He looked like a king on the edge of ruin. Armor of dark leather and silver gleamed under the sun, but his eyes were hollow. Haunted. When he saw me approach, hand in hand with Jax, something raw and desperate flashed across his face. The pack parted silently as we walked forward. Kael stepped down from the raised stone platform. He stopped several paces away, close enough to speak, far enough to respect the distance I had carved between us. Nova, he said, voice rough with everything he hadn't slept off. You came. I came for my child. I answered. Not for you. His gaze dropped to my belly, then lifted again, pain etched so deeply it looked permanent. I know, he breathed. I know I don't deserve to ask anything of you. But the Shadowborn, they're using dark magic. Mara has given them an opening into our lands. If we don't stop them here, they'll take everything. Including the pup. I felt Jax tense beside me, but he stayed silent. Letting me lead. I lifted my chin. Then we fight, I said. But when it's over, you and I are finished. There is no going back. Kael closed his eyes for a long moment, as if absorbing the finality of the words. When he opened them again, tears shimmered on his lashes. I accept that, he whispered. As long as you and the child live. I accept it. The horns sounded again. Closer now. The ground trembled. From the far tree-line, darkness poured out. Mara led them, flanked by twisted, shadow-wreathed wolves whose eyes glowed the same unnatural silver as hers. Behind her marched creatures of nightmare, half wolf, half smoke, claws dripping black ichor. The air turned cold. Kael turned to his pack and raised his voice. Silver Fang. For our home. For our future. For the child of our blood. A roar answered him. Fierce. United. Then, the battle began. It was chaos and fury and heartbreak all at once. I stayed near the center, protected by Jax's massive wolf form and a circle of loyal betas. But I didn't hide. I fought with everything I had. Claws, teeth, the silver light that had awakened inside me the night before. Every time a Shadowborn lunged toward me, that protective glow flared, shattering their darkness, driving them back. Across the field, Kael fought like a man possessed. He tore through the enemy ranks, but his eyes kept finding me. Every glance filled with regret. With longing. With a love he knew he had lost forever. Mara broke through the line. She came straight for me, rune blazing, shadows whipping around her like a storm. You think you can take everything from me? She screamed. He was supposed to be mine. I met her gaze without flinching. He was never yours, I said. And he never will be. She lunged. Jax intercepted her, snarling, snapping, but she was fast, fueled by dark power. I stepped forward. The silver light inside me surged, brighter than ever. I placed both hands on Mara's chest as she reached for me. The contact was electric. Light met darkness. And the darkness shattered. Mara screamed, a sound of pure agony, as the rune on her palm cracked and crumbled to ash. The shadows around her dissolved. She collapsed to her knees, eyes wide with shock and sudden clarity. The Shadowborn faltered. The pack pressed the advantage. Within minutes, the battlefield fell silent. The enemy retreated, scattered, broken. Mara remained on her knees, staring at her empty hands. Kael walked slowly toward us. He stopped in front of me. Blood streaked his face, but his eyes were clear for the first time in weeks. Sorrow. Acceptance. Closure. Thank you, he said softly. For saving them. For saving us all. I looked at him. Really looked. And felt the last remnants of anger soften into something quieter. You're welcome, I whispered. Then I turned to Jax. He shifted back, standing tall and steady beside me. I took his hand. Kael watched the gesture, pain flickering across his face one last time, then bowed his head. I release you, he said, voice breaking. Both of you. Be happy. Be safe. He turned and walked away. Shoulders bowed, but steps sure. The pack watched in silence. And in that moment, under the afternoon sun, I felt the weight of everything lift. I looked up at Jax. My rogue. My anchor. My future. He smiled. Small. Real. Radiant. And I smiled back. As the sun begins to set, painting the battlefield gold, a soft, unfamiliar voice whispers through my mind. Not the pack link. Not Mara's venom. But something new. And gentle. Mother. I'm almost here. The battlefield lay quiet under the setting sun, gold bleeding into the edges of every scar the earth carried. The last echoes of war had faded. The Shadowborn were gone, scattered or broken. Mara had been taken away in chains, her rune dead and her eyes empty of the fire that once consumed her. The pack stood in hushed awe, watching the sky turn the softest shades of rose and violet. And then, that small, gentle voice whispered again through my mind. Clearer now. Sweeter than moonlight. Mother. I'm almost here. My breath caught. My hand flew to my belly, feeling the flutter become a gentle, insistent kick. Jax was at my side in an instant, his strong arms sliding around my waist to steady me. Nova. His voice was thick with worry and wonder. I looked up at him, tears already shimmering in my eyes. She's coming, I whispered. Our little one. She's ready. The words hung between us like a promise kept. The pack began to gather closer. Slowly. Reverently. Kael stood at the edge of the circle, head bowed, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't approach. He simply watched with a mixture of sorrow and quiet, aching gratitude. I met his gaze for one long moment. No anger left. No hatred. Only the bittersweet understanding that some loves are meant to end so others can begin. Then, I turned fully to Jax. He cupped my face with both hands, gentle trembling. "I'm here," he said, voice rough with emotion. Every step. Every breath. I leaned into his touch, letting the warmth of him chase away the last shadows of doubt. "We're going to be a family," I whispered. Jax's eyes shone. He pressed his forehead to mine. "I've waited lifetimes for this," he breathed. "For you. For her." The first contraction came then. Soft at first, then stronger. Like the moon pulling the tide. I gasped. Jax lifted me effortlessly into his arms, carrying me toward the sheltered grove at the edge of the battlefield, a place ringed by ancient oaks where the moonlight pooled like silver water. The pack followed at a respectful distance, forming a quiet, protective circle. They sang, an old lullaby of the Silver Fang, voices rising and falling like waves. I lay on a bed of soft moss and blankets they had prepared, Jax kneeling beside me, holding my hand through every wave of pain and power. Hours passed, time stretching and folding in on itself. And then, under a sky full of stars, she arrived. A tiny cry pierced the night. Strong. Fierce. Perfect. Jax lifted her gently, tears streaming down his scarred face as he placed her on my chest. She was small, warm, covered in the softest down of silver fur that shimmered like moonlight. Her eyes, when they opened, were the color of storm clouds at dawn, gray with flecks of gold. "Our daughter," I whispered. I looked at Jax. My rogue. My heart. My home. And felt a joy so deep it hurt in the most beautiful way. "She's perfect." He leaned down, pressing a tender kiss to my forehead, then to hers. "She's ours," he said, voice breaking with wonder. Behind us, the pack's song swelled. Joyful. Triumphant. Kael stepped forward then. Just one step. Enough to see her clearly. He smiled. Small. Sad. And full of love he would never fully claim. "She has your strength, Nova," he said softly. "And her father's heart." Then he bowed his head and stepped back, giving us the space we deserved. The moon rose higher, bathing us all in silver light. I looked up at Jax, my chosen mate, my forever, and felt the last broken pieces of my soul knit together. Not with the old bond. Not with the pain of the past. But with something new. Something real. Something ours. We were no longer the betrayed Luna and the wandering rogue. We were a family. We were whole. And as our daughter's tiny fingers curled around mine, I smiled through happy tears. The dawn was coming. And it was beautiful. You have just listened to a tale from the Moonlight Mates Library. If Nova's journey from a shattered Luna to a fierce mother and queen touched your heart, please leave a like and share this story with someone who needs to believe in second chances. And I'm curious, tell me in the comments below, do you think Kael deserves forgiveness after spending his life atoning? Or was Nova right to keep him at a distance forever? To uncover more stories of rejected mates, healing love, and poetic justice, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell. The library is always open for you. Until the next chapter, sweet dreams.